Hi, I'm Gill Stannard. I'm a naturopath and herbalist and mentor. And today I'm very happy to have my friend and mentor, Sue Evans, back in for a video. And I want to talk about something today that's really having a hot minute in herbal medicine and naturopathy here in Australia, and that is medical astrology. Now, Sue, where did your interest in astrology kind of begin?
I think I got interested in astrology about the same time that I got interested in herbal medicine, which was way back in the mid 70s, whoever could believe it. And I think that, at that stage, the way that astrology was practiced was much more influenced by Jung, much more psychological astrology. These days, there's more recently, there's been some different influences coming in. But one of the things that has always fascinated me about the connection between herbal medicine and astrology is, of course, through classics like Culpeper. And I've always been interested in in traditional knowledge, and what is it if we come from the perspective that we respect our elders, and that the herbalists who were practicing and writing, in the Middle Ages and previously to that, and all the way through, if we come from the perspective that they knew what they were doing, then when we look at their writings, we really need to understand the context. And of course, one of the things that has perplexed certainly modern students for a very long time has been Culpeper's assigning of rulerships to particular plants, and what does that mean? And when Culpeper says, a herbalist who doesn't use astrology is like a lamp without oil, like what does he mean that it is so that perspective is so fundamental to his practice? So as I learnt more about both systems, it wasn't, I'm certainly not a medical astrologer, and I haven't, it's still somewhat perplexing to me. So, Pisces rules the feet and Aries rules the head. Well, actually, how do you make that applicable in practice? But some of the ideas, like the ideas of the elements, for example, earth, water, fire, and air, and whether somebody is particularly earthy, watery, fiery, or airy, those kind of concepts are very applicable, I think, to to natural medicine, and to understand.
Okay, do you want to give an example of that? So, what you mean?
Well, I'll give a personal example. I remember talking to a friend of mine who's very earthy, who happens to be a Taurian, and very, very practical. And I remember years ago saying to her, "Oh, look," we were talking about eating. I said, "Oh, how many times, like, how often do you miss a meal?" And she just looked at me very seriously and said, "Sue, I don't think I've ever missed a meal." Whereas for me, where ideas and air and it is so much more dominant, it's how many times this week or how many times today have I missed? I can't do it so much these days, but certainly in the past. So understanding that somebody who's very fiery might get very involved in projects or very involved in something for a while, and they'll burn very hot, around that, but then they'll collapse, and then they'll need a time, just as a fire goes out, they'll need a time to recover. And also, if somebody's very fiery, they might be very incredibly passionate about their ideas, but fire warms, but it also burns. And so people close to that very passionate individual can get quite hurt. And yeah, so it's those kind of those kind of elemental ideas. And of course, you know, the elements are, you know, are certainly, you know, very fundamental to, you know, Ayurvedic medicine, you know, certainly fundamental TCM in traditional systems of medicine. And they were fundamental to the practice of herbal medicine for a long time. But, you know, today, I think, well, and as I've said, you know, we all understand what the words earthy, fiery, watery, and airy mean, which means that, you know, we still have some understanding within our culture as to, you know, if somebody's an airhead, you know, well, you know, you don't really expect them, you know, to be, you know, wonderfully detail conscious and to remember to put things out necessarily, you know, because actually they've been thinking about something else. Whereas, you know, your practical, earthy, pragmatic person, you know, might not be the person to inspire you to start a new project, but they will be the person who will remember the details.
I'm just thinking really tangentially in a practical sense, because I am an earth sign and I'm very practical. Just thinking even in those broadest elemental terms, in terms of patient management and understanding our patients, that if you've, you know, even if you don't know what they are, Google the air, Google what the air, you know, what the air signs are and what dates they are. And if you've got a client who's perhaps chronically late or forgetful or whatever else, you know, sometimes you can have a little bit more forgiveness and understanding if
That's
you can think that, or your earth signs, your Capricorns, Virgos, and Tauruses are going to be there. We're going to be there 2 minutes before the meeting or longer, or they will send you an email for a Zoom to say exact time I'm going to be 2 more minutes and be 2 more minutes. So, I mean, they're really, although they're very broad and general, we know that astrology is so much more than what your star sign is. You know, when you see someone has some particular, you know, really watery characteristics or whatever else, you know, that if something's emotionally going on for them, you could be in for a long ride in that consultation.
And I think that one of the things about this also, Gill, is that really, you know, if we think that, you know, one of our major roles is to help our patients or clients understand themselves better, then for you know, somebody like me to understand that, oh, actually, no, I probably do need to pay particular attention to eating 3 times a day, whereas my very earthy friend, you know, doesn't, you know, might need to, you know, it's knowing our own strengths and weaknesses, and so understanding our body particularly well. So, I mean, I think, you know, astrology can be applied to, you know, anything. You know, it's applied to world events or, you know, person psychology, or, you know, and yes, there are people who are specializing in that area. And, you know, in Australia, that's, you know, Kira Sutherland, you know, there's people like Judith Hill or Lehman or Claire Gallagher, you know, who are putting astrologers who have also a background, many of them also have a background in natural health. And so they'll go much more specifically into either the strengths or weaknesses of an individual, or bringing it into, well, you know, how do these two, you know, what is the contribution, you know, of medical astrology, you know, these days. I'm still somewhat confused about plant rulerships, I must say. You know, it's, and Lee Lehman is somebody who was a botanist and also a traditional astrologer, and she did some quite interesting work some years ago where she went through a number of different herbals that looked at astrological rulerships, and of course found that, you know, authors didn't all agree on, you know, what planet used rule in what sign ruled what plant. And there are, I mean, if you read Culpeper, I mean, Culpeper will say, well, you know, this plant might be a herb of, you know, Jupiter and Cancer, and therefore it's useful for these particular diseases. Whereas somebody like Dylan Warren Davis, who's another herbalist who's also got a background in astrology, talks about the fact that it's useful to look at where at the sign that a planet is in, and the planet that it rules, as indicating where the plant grows and what it's useful for. And what he will say is that the Sun, Mars, and Jupiter are all warming planets, whereas the Moon, Venus, and Saturn are all cooling planets. And these were and Mercury goes either way. These were the seven traditional planets. And so if you're trying to stimulate activity, you'd use the warming planets. If you're trying to reduce activity overall, you'd use the cooling planets. And he suggests that the sign represents the place that where you will most likely find that plant. So if it's a Cancer, if it's a ruled, if it's within the sign of Cancer, it might be by a river. If it's in Pisces, it might be by the sea. If it's in Scorpio, it might be by stagnant water. So, for example, he takes as an example willow, which is a herb of the moon in Cancer, and he'll say, okay, so it's cooling, and you find it by a river. Whereas if it's a herb of the sun in Leo, it'll be a warming planet, and you'll find it, in a more expansive place. So, but I think these are all, herbs have been around for so long, Jill, and people with such completely different perspectives on how the world works, have been looking at applying this to herbal medicine. That it depends, what do you want to learn about the plants? How do you apply this to that? Don't know whether
if there's a budding herbalist out there, or an experienced herbalist who's kind of wanting to deepen their understanding of herbs, because one thing that I see quite a lot of mentoring is, while our evidence-based constituents have had a lot of time in the sun over the last couple of decades, there are a lot of herbalists who are happy to hold that space, but also want to connect to their roots, quite literally. So, how can you, what's the gateway for a herbalist who wants to understand traditional herbal medicine, perhaps with, and will come across, if they're reading Culpeper, they'll come across astrological references. What is there any kind of decoder or way or whatever to help someone understand their herbs through the assistance of Culpeper?
Well,
sorry, the curly one.
1977 to now is what, how many years is that? That's a very long time. I don't know that I've actually got to first base yet, really. Yeah. So
now, to not be overwhelmed that you don't understand it all, just kind of like it's just.
Yeah. And I think as with getting to know any herb, I mean, really, you start with one or two, and you see, okay, now what is this? Does this help my understanding, and in what way does this help my understanding? There's of course Graham Tobyn's book. Graham Tobyn wrote. Does this? Oh, I don't know.
Oh, yes, it's on my bookshelf unread.
Yes, Culpeper's medicine.
Yeah.
So, I mean, his Tobyn is from University of Central Lancashire, and so that's, if you like a reasonably historical academic kind of approach to that, Tobyn is a good way in. If your interest is coming through more basic astrology, then certainly Judith Hill's website, and of course Kira Sutherland's work, where she melds naturopathic principles with astrological principles. I think that those are certainly, all really useful. There's another woman, Claire Gallagher, who very much looks at elements. She's got a book called Body Astrology, very much looks at how the elements might, how we might use the elements to support our health, if we understand that. But and of course with Culpeper, I mean, he goes much further than just, you know, which plant is ruled by, you know, which planet in which sign. That he does this really fascinating thing where he draws up a chart called a decumbrature chart, where he draws up a chart for the moment that a person falls ill, and has very strict rules as to, and these come from traditional astrology, very strict rules about how you might read that chart. And if you're interested in it, in the history of it, I mean, there's some fascinating examples, you know, where he will talk about just from the chart, you know, what the person is suffering from, and, you know, and also what the best treatment is, and what sort of herbs you should be thinking about. I mean, he went into enormous detail about all of that, but that would require probably an intermediate understanding of astrology and an interest in that, you know, that you know, if you're interested in okay, so where, you know, how was herbal medicine practiced in the 17th century, you know, then that's certainly a place to go. And yeah, I mean, to me, the astrological rulerships give us one of the stories about a particular plant. And I do think, you know, that certainly your traditional understanding is very much around the stories of the plants, and the stories of the plants will help me connect, you know, with what the plant looks like, with how it grows, with what it might be useful for. And I think that, you know, that's probably for me, the unrealized potential of herbal medicine is that while it's been incredibly useful to find out so much, to go down the path that herbal medicine has gone down over the last 40 years of increasing the evidence base and bringing, I suppose, in lots of ways, bringing herbal medicine into the 21st century. The thing that we've lost is our connection with the actual living plant. And I do think that is, you know, one of the things that is, yeah, to me is a great sadness that so many practitioners, let alone so many people who consume herbal medicine, really only know the names of the plants from the labels on the bottles or the labels on the tablets, whereas they wouldn't recognize the actual plant itself. And, you know, in these days of such, you know, climate challenges and challenges to our planet, then it's an unrealized potential for us to be able to connect more with the plants around us. Our culture generally suffers from plant blindness, and it's a real this is something that as herbalists we don't need to do. You know, we can and by understanding not only that, you know, this is what this particular plant looks like, but also, oh, okay, and in the past these were the stories about it, and these were this is what they said in the 5th century or the 17th century or whatever. I mean, it's just, I just find that the inspiring part of herbal medicine.
So, you know, I think one thing we can take from this is, regardless if you're interested in astrology or not, this is just another pathway into the story and to knowing the plant. Now more than ever, herbalists and naturopaths really have to make an effort to get to know plants. And so one of the things you've been pretty big on, and I totally understand, is kind of a takeaway from emerging practitioners, is to get to know a smaller number of plants well. We both have concerns, as much as I love having an external dispensary, but that was after 20-something years of dispensing the herbs where I would smell every herb. So you're also getting to the position where some newer practitioners may not know what a herb smells like, even in a tincture form, let alone know what it like in the plant form. So maybe then it's as simple as look around you for even just the English weeds that grow through a lot of parts of Australia. What side of the street are they on? Are they the sunny side, the dark side? Is the ground really dry? Is it wet? How resilient is it? And I want to go back to something that you did with us, or Southern School taught us, and then when I took over what was fourth year herbal medicine at Southern School, we did, and I think was my favorite exercise, which was you got to choose one herb that you resonated with, and then you took it, I think, first as a tea, and then you took it an increasing dose. For 1 week, you took it as a tea. Then the next week, you took 1 ml doses 3 times a day, and then you worked your way up over a number of weeks. And that it was like an observational study. How did this make me feel? What was different in the different forms that I took it in? And I think, just actually writing an article for Mentoring Newsletter at the moment, when I kind of think one of the things that makes me happy as a practitioner is that my decision to be a naturopath and herbalist meant I am committed to learning for life. So it doesn't matter if it's 30-something years on, 40-something years on, you're new to the practice. Yeah. To go back and do something to reconnect you with the plant. And I think that's a fantastic takeaway message we can have today.
And I think, Gill, and I'm not sure whether this is in Sydney, I'm in Melbourne, and certainly in the south. At the moment, marigolds, there are marigolds everywhere. Marigolds is, the name marigold comes from Mary's gold, right? Okay, so, and a lot of the very common plants that were used in domestic medicine have a connection with Mary, because that was the way that the Christian church kind of took over from the pagan traditions of the Earth Mother. Marigold is a herb of the sun in Leo. Marigold, it opens with the sunshine and it closes at night. So the sun, sun is there during the day and it closes at night. The fact that, one of the things about the signs is that, okay, it's a herb of the sun in Leo, and Leo in the northern hemisphere is August, but, in the southern, which is midsummer, whereas here it's midwinter. So, there are questions about all of that. But I think even thinking about marigold and the sun and opening and closing the petals, each day, it's one way of, do you recognize the marigolds that are growing, around you? And also then you start to think about, okay, all right, so how can, what's the soil that's grown in, and can I use those flowers to make an ointment, and just all of that sort of thing. Draw them. That's the other way. The other exercise I used to do with students was to take them out and get them to draw a plant. And it's not, I'm the world's worst artist, really. And it's not a matter of whether you can draw it or not, but it's a meditative exercise when you're focusing on that plant and you're just drawing that plant. You are really focusing on the form of that plant. And it does assist you to get to know it better.
Yeah. So grow the plant, draw the plant, consume the plant in different ways, and through all those processes, do your version of meditating on it to try to kind of get the sense of what this plant is telling you, and then think, how do I apply this knowledge in a clinical setting? I think that's
and if one plant, the thing about knowing one or two plants is that then you know how to know a plant. You learn the process, and so you can expand that out, and you probably will, if you've got 160 herbs in the dispensary that you use, you probably will never know the 160 in that way, but you will know some of them really, really well. And I think that's the really important thing.
Which is kind of interesting aside. I do love the sisters who own Araya, the dispensary service. And when I've talked to Shiloh, she goes, I always know your prescriptions, Jill, because they're quite different to others. And I said, in what way? I said, well, you kind of use herbs that not everyone's using. And I went, what, the English weeds? So, I mean,
Yeah.
my back to basics is always, look for the weeds around you that are medicinal. We're going to wrap this up in a second, but I also remember, we talked about place. So you're saying, well, we're talking about Melbourne and the calendula, and I immediately went to the cemetery in Carlton where they used to, in spring, somebody must have planted one time, and they're everywhere. So go have a look there if you're in there. But also that I remember when you moved to Northern Rivers to teach at Southern Cross, that it was like, oh, it's a whole new climate. I've got to, and it's like, where in Melbourne you kind of go from those warming kind of herbs for about, 7 months a year. There it's like, oh, what do you do to cool? These are too hot. These are all those sorts of things. And I suppose that's another reminder too, with a much more global, or at least national client base these days, with most of us, or many of us working online, is that I make it, having lived now in Melbourne and Sydney for significant periods of time, it is totally different climate here, and it's only 1,000 or so kilometres away, let alone if I'm working with somebody in Northern Territory or Queensland. So we've also got to encourage the plants. We're going to know the plants. We're also going to know the application of the plants in different climates. Gosh, our work's got so. I mean, I kind of miss the local herbalists just working with what's around and everything like that. But also, as a bit of a plug, I really am going. So we maybe put some links below.
Yeah.
I have just ordered my copy of the, I can't remember what it's called, The Memories of Christopher Headley.
Headley's book, yes, yeah.
It's been edited by your British colleague,
Guy Waddell.
It's put out through Aeon, AEON. It should be very soon. I've got a digital copy, or coming when it does. But that's Christopher Headley is a gorgeous herbalist that we both knew, who's unfortunately no longer with us anymore. He was a gentle giant who was really good at sharing some of these stories. So if you want to get mixed stories, I think that would be a great book. Also, if you can get a hold of any Christopher and his wife Non Shaw's books, are really beautiful. And my other pick would be good old Mrs. Grieve. That's how I learned. Learning plants. I remember the dandelion, the dent de lion, the teeth of the lion, and all those sorts of things. And she throws in a bit of Culpeper there, doesn't she?
She does. She's great on stories. I mean, she's she's completely and utterly outdated on constituents. You wouldn't look at her for that, but certainly in terms of in terms of the stories and in terms of the old uses of the herbs. And I think that's the other thing. I know we have to finish up, Jill.
Yeah, we're finishing, people.
But one of the things that's happened with the way that herbal medicine has developed more recently is that we're going to the herb where we've got the most research on a particular plant. And of course, I always come back to St. John's wort, that we've got a lot of research in terms of St. John's wort's use in terms of psychological states, and particularly for depression. So we've forgotten its actions in terms of nerve pain, because we go to, we're just going to, we're going to specifics. Whereas I think if you go back to Grieve and to the old herbalists, where they had a fewer number of herbs, then they used all of those herbs to the extent that you could. So for a lot of those different, for a lot of different actions. And yes, there's sifting to be done as to what's going to be useful, what's going to be appropriate or not appropriate in terms of those actions. But we've the pendulum has swung a long way. I guess that's what I'm saying.
What we're trying to do is get that pendulum back to the middle, and to inspire the love that we both share for herbs and for healing. So thanks so much, Sue. I'm going to try to put a few links, if I can bother you, for a few of those names. Put them when I put this up on YouTube. And if you enjoyed this, I'm going to do the usual YouTube thing. Could you please subscribe, press the bell if you want to be notified, and check out the channel for other videos. I've got a bundle with Sue and some other wonderful people. So thank you so much, Sue.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jill.